You mentioned that you're also part of scrum.org, right? Or you have been practicing Scrum all along as well. So these days, this term is not new. It's been a while.
Yeah.
But still, companies are still trying to do agile transformations within their organizations, especially for those companies who are probably a bit lagging behind from traditional world. So in your view, in your professional career and maybe
Yeah.
consulting, do you see any kind of reasons why agile transformations sometimes fail and people starts to become skeptical about agile these days? Because I
Yeah.
think people start to become skeptical if they apply something, but it doesn't really work fully. So maybe you can explain here why some agile transformations actually fail.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because in the beginning days of me implementing Scrum, you could really see that it was only applied within the IT departments, at software teams. And we were quite successful back then in applying that. And at some point, organizations started seeing the benefits of that and wanting to scale that up to the organizational level. And I think basically that's what we are currently in. I think it was like 10 years ago when organizations started shifting. What you currently see is that a lot of large corporates try to implement agile at the organizational level, but I think the way they do it is very transactional. So, meaning they are focusing a lot on structure, processes, introducing new tools, new roles, scaling frameworks, all that kind of stuff. But what they fail to really change is their culture. I've been following this survey by, I think it was version one who started with it. Now it's a company called Digital AI. They call it the state of agile. And what you see in that survey as well is that in the last 8 years, more and more companies have started adopting agile. But for some reason, their team maturity, their capability of self-organizing doesn't go up. This is also what the survey reveals is that people see that practices are being applied, but they see that their organization is not able to adopt a culture that looks like the Agile Manifesto. Everything that's been said in the Agile Manifesto, individuals and interactions over the process and tools and all that kind of stuff. So there's a shift in culture when you start working agile. And I think if the organization doesn't have a burning platform to actually change their culture, agile implementations and agile transformations will kind of get stuck, which I call the glass ceiling. If there's 5 levels of maturity, I think they kind of get stuck at level 2, level 3 in their maturity. And I think that's basically what we're seeing still nowadays. And that hasn't changed a lot over the last few years.
So you mentioned something that intrigued me. You mentioned like many companies try to do it in a transactional way.
Yeah.
Transactional means like they force a certain process, tools, maybe the scaling framework and all these things. But
Yeah.
actually what you're saying is the underlying important thing is actually the culture. And I can see many agile certifications or maybe professionals who also just preach, okay, here are a set of practices that we need to do. These are the roles that we need to have in the team. What would you change differently knowing about this situation? How can we become more focused starting from the culture? What kind of things that maybe leaders need to do in order to start prioritizing from there rather than the transactional part?
Yeah, I think it starts with realization that something really needs to change. There's many reasons why organizations nowadays start adopting agile. I think a lot of the reasons are because everybody's doing it or because the management team wants to change or to save cost, which is, in my opinion, the worst reason to start doing it. I mean, it's going to cost you in the beginning because changing culture, a shift towards a more agile team-based mindset is a hard change. And I think many organizations that have been around there for maybe more than 100 years, they aren't built on mechanisms that are based on self-organizing teams. They're based on this like hero executive leader that makes all the decisions. And then the teams, they implement, they follow, and they do not lead actually. And I think what you should start with as a leader when you really want to reap the benefits of agile in your organization, it starts with a need to change. If you have a large corporate organization with many people working there, they're going to go along maybe for like a few months or maybe a year, but then they will fall back into old behavior because there is no real need to change. So I think leaders need to connect the reasons for becoming really agile. If they really want agile and if they want to reap the benefits of that, to connect that to the problems that they're having and help people understand how agile actually helps you to solve these problems. And basically, it comes down to a switch in culture where leaders are capable of delegating more and more responsibilities towards the teams with the goal of accomplishing faster results, right? Where teams can make faster decisions without the bureaucracy that we see in many of these traditional corporates. And I think that's basically where it starts, to connect the reason for the change with understanding what it means to change a culture.
Yeah, speaking about culture, I'm also a leader myself. Sometimes it's really tricky where to start. We know, we understand we need to change. We can see so-called the burning platform you mentioned, the pain points that people are doing. But culture is something that is not easy and straightforward to change. It needs like an organic effort by everyone. First, they need to
Yeah.
understand the why, and then they need to understand the need to change and things like that. So, what do you think is the best place to start changing this culture? Is it something like you create a town hall meeting telling everyone, or is this a set of dogs, or is there any better way to do that?
Yeah, that's a very good question, actually. Let me first start by answering the question with the worst place to start with the change, and that is everywhere in your organization. Because I see like large scale agile transformations, like the whole company is subject to the change. From my experience in the last at least 12 years with agile transformations, is I would say start at that location in your organization where the most complexity resides, because that's where the biggest benefits can occur. If you look at Scrum, for example, Scrum was designed to solve complex problems. It wasn't designed in simple problems or maybe complicated problems, because we've been actually capable of solving these problems already for many years before. Scrum was designed to solve complex problems in a complex space. That's what we typically do when we start working with organizations. For example, just very recently, last week, we started a new change in an organization. We actually explicitly picked the one project that is in the most complex domain inside the organization. They have so many challenges, like the entire industry is changing all the time, and the organization cannot keep up with the change anymore. And I think that's basically the pockets of excellence within the organization where Agile can become very successful, is there where the most complexity is, because well, the frameworks that we've been using are designed to solve complexity. And I think that's basically where you should start. Well, it sounds a little counterintuitive, right? Because I've seen many teams start where it's easiest, but you don't prove that you're actually making a big difference by doing that.
So you mentioned about complex, not complicated. Are you referring to Kinefin model? So maybe for people who are not familiar yet, how do you differentiate complex versus complicated
Yeah,
and
that's a
things like
good
that?
question. Yeah, and I do reference to the Kinefin model a lot. I tend to use that a lot as well when I explain what complexity is. Basically, the most simple way to explain what complexity means is that when everything is in flux, so requirements are in flux. Like I always tell my new clients, customers think they know what they want until they see what they get, and then they want something completely different. Since technology is changing faster and faster nowadays, this phenomenon has increased enormously over the last 10 years, I think. And because of that phenomenon, we end up in a complex domain. Like all the requirements keep changing, technology keeps changing. And as a result of that, the knowledge that people need needs to be updated faster and faster. And because of that dynamic, I think we are in the middle of the complex domain and we need solutions to solve those problems in the complex domain. So that's basically what I mean with that.
And also not to mention that the competitors are changing a lot as well, the disruptor, the startups, right? So I think this is also
Definitely.
one thing why it becomes more complex. We mentioned about this start from a complex, maybe most complex projects in the company, most complex
Mhm.
departments, but
Yeah.
you need certain kind of leader, right? So coming to your bread and butter, which is to develop professional agile leader. What is
Yeah.
the most important pattern, do you think, for an agile leader to be successful heading this transformation or running these agile practices?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. Well, I think basically, and this might feel a little counterintuitive because most of the leaders don't think about this. First, understand what your current culture is. I mean, I've been working with so many transformations in the past where we started off with a, very idealistic way of implementing Scrum in the organization. And then we bumped into a lot of cultural problems. So if you are not aware of the current culture in your organization, if you can't measure that, make that explicit, there will be a lot of surprises when you start to change things. So I think the basic pattern is understand your culture, understand also the type of leaders that you have currently deployed and employed. Try to predict if those leaders are capable of making the shift towards like delegating more towards teams, because we are going to change the organization. We're going to replace the hero leader kind of basis by self-organizing teams that can make decisions, where leaders shift towards more supporting those teams to do the job themselves. One of the patterns, for example, that we've been using in our leadership class is to, maybe you heard about the book by Jim Collins, Good to Great, where he talks
Yep.
about getting the right people on the bus first. And I think basically what he means with that is what we have seen as well in our transformations is that if you start focusing on the leaders that should move the transformation forward, for example, the scrum masters, the product owners, the tech leads in the teams that need to help the team move forward and grow more mature and take more responsibility, But if you as managers start to focus on these people in the organization, you will see a shift in the leadership culture in your organization. And at the moment that those leaders inside the teams can actually take more responsibility, of course, you as a leader need to be prepared to let go. And that's basically what we've seen a lot, is that there's always tension between teams wanting more responsibility, teams being able to take more responsibility. And once they are, the ability of the leader to let go of their responsibility once that happens. That's
Right.
basically the pattern we've been applying a lot since the last 12 years.
So you mentioned this key concept from good to great, which is to get the right people on the bus in your company or in your team. Maybe tell us a more practical advice. How do you assess these leaders, whether they are the right people? What kind of characters, behaviors, traits, or things like that, maybe?
Yeah, so maybe I'll use an example from my own experiences in the very recent years. During the COVID situation, I started a new assignment there. I became interim manager for a company that I work with. Well, the first thing I started looking at, of course, I was responsible for 8 to 9 teams. And do we have the right leaders in the teams? In some of the teams, the answer was definitely yes. There were scrum masters, product owners who were really keen to fill in their role good. But obviously, there's always like 1 or 2 teams that do not have the right leaders yet. So we started thinking about, so if they don't have the right leaders, how could we help those teams move forward? We started looking at our recruitment process, for example. If you're recruiting a new product owner, what's the type of questions you kind of ask them? And a few of those things is people need to be humble enough to understand that the team can take over at some point in time. People need also to be hungry to make the next step and move forward. And they also need the emotional intelligence to build up a team, right? And so we've been using these kind of questions in our recruitment process. So we were hiring a new product owner, and I still remember we asked that new product owner the question, like, tell us about the failures you've had in the past. And of course, the reason why we asked that question is we were just testing if he was humble enough to admit that also he makes mistakes. And that's okay because people learn from those mistakes. But we ended up in a conversation where this product owner always mentioned like, yeah, but I do this right and I have that certification. So testing the humbleness was something that we're doing there. And this is just one of the examples that we've been using to see, do we have the right people? And that I think admitting that you also make mistakes and that you are actually learning from these mistakes is one of the biggest qualities you could actually look for in a team and in a leadership team.
Yeah, I really love what you said, humbleness, right? So the admittance that you did some mistakes, it may be catastrophic, it may be small, but at least the humbleness to actually mention about that. And
Yeah.
the other thing that I would add probably is about ownership, because you keep mentioning about self-organizing team, right? So the leaders need to be able to also own the things that they are leading so that you don't
Definitely.
always need to go back to the leader.